Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to begin. May I request everyone to please be seated. We'll be starting very soon. Once again, may I request those who are crowding the area near the exit door, please vacate the area. Please be seated. May I request the chairperson and editorial director, Hindustan Times, Mr. Shobna Bhartia, to please introduce our keynote speaker.
Sorry about this delay, ladies and gentlemen. Just bear with us. Yeah. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm extremely sorry that we are running behind schedule, something that we normally try and avoid at the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. It's my honor and privilege to welcome to India for his first visit to the country after his presidency and for his first appearance in the Hindustan Times Leadership Summit, Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States. Equality should be Barack Obama's middle name, but I don't think he will object to being called a first among equals. The first black man to be president of the Harvard Law Review, the first person of color to be elected to the White House, and because that wasn't a flash in the pan, the first man of color to be elected twice to the White House. The list goes on. He's an original American firster. Mr. Obama has been more than just a model in the way in which he has lived his life and led his country. He has been an inspiration both as president and a world leader. That's not easy in a time when the motto of voters everywhere seems to be change for change's sake. Mr. Obama came to power when Americans and people around the world were experiencing a crisis of faith about their leaders. Mr. Obama promised change, but made it clear it had come both from the top and the base. And I quote, "Change will not come if we wait for some other person or some other time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the change that we seek," unquote. President Obama is a man of the world, literally. Born of a white mother from Kansas and a Kenyan father, raised in Indonesia and Hawaii, his extended family, in his own words, is a mini United Nations. Talk about having a head start in understanding how the other half, even the other 100, thinks. Learning to stand in somebody else's shoes and to see through their eyes, that's how peace begins. Among the multicultural skills he claims is the ability to cook lentils South Asian style. Sadly, dal baraki will not be on offer at today's lunch. After an education that included 2 Ivy brands, Columbia and Harvard, his pocket biographies say he became a community organizer. Understand what this bland term encompasses. Setting up job training and college tutoring programs, drives to promote tenant rights, and register tens of thousands of black voters. Indeed, the only community he has had difficulty organizing has been the members of the US Congress. He served as a civil rights lawyer and taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago before daring to tread into politics. In the electoral arena, he was an immediate success. His early political career was a steep J-curve that propelled him from the state legislature to the Democratic Party presidential candidacy in 2008. We take it for granted today, but let us admit, none of us believed a black American would ever be US president in our lifetime. Mr. Obama showed miracles can happen, but they happen when accompanied by hard work, innovative campaigning, and a silver tongue. A second miracle, he even gave up smoking, though there the hard work and the campaigning was done by his brilliant wife, Michelle. His presidency will be remembered among Americans for the gay rights victory, for introducing universal health care, and for deft economic footwork that helped pull the world from the brink of financial oblivion. He also sustained the trajectory of ever closer relations between India and the US that has now survived 4 Oval Office presidents. President Obama believed his country had to tame its domestic dragons before it could afford to slay them overseas. Yet, he did not shy from bringing lethal justice to the world's most feared terrorist, Osama bin Laden, and recommitting US troops to Iraq when the so-called Islamic State reared its head. He once explained the Obama doctrine on military force, and I quote, "I am not opposed to all war, I am opposed to dumb war," unquote. He shrugged off political heat to take up climate change. It was the anvil on which he forged a strong and durable relationship with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The world is now alive with buzz about electrical vehicles. President Obama called on his country to drive on batteries 7 years ago. We have with us a world leader who has soared above petty concerns without forgetting to care for small causes. If someone finds a certificate showing he was born here, perhaps Mr. Obama should consider running for office in India. I have a feeling he will do very well. He has been for us, will be for our children, and for any person who fears their color, or creed or class banishes them to the margins of society, an extraordinary inspiration. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Barack Obama.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh. Thank you so much. Shvana, thank you so much for the very gracious introduction. And thank you all for having me at the annual Hindustan Times Leadership Summit. I look forward to sitting down with Karan and having an excellent discussion, but I'm going to make a few brief remarks at the top. It's wonderful to be back in Delhi. Almost 3 years ago, I had the tremendous honor of being the first American president to join you at Republic Day. A little over 7 years ago, I had my first stop on a visit to Asia, and I had the privilege to address your parliament. In 2009, I recognized India at the White House with the first state visit of my presidency, and we were dancing some good Bhangra while we were there. We brought the first Diwali to the White House, and we celebrated it each year for 8 years, and I was proud to be the only U.S. president to visit India twice during my time in office. I should mention, because a number of you asked, Michelle resents the fact that I did not bring her on this trip. And she sends you all regards. All these activities with India were more than just symbolic events. There are millions of Indian Americans, of course, who are proud of their heritage, build bridges between our countries, and make extraordinary contributions every single day to American society. America and India alike are defined by countless languages and dialects, different genders, orientations, every caste, color, and creed. Your Constitution begins with the pledge to uphold the dignity of the individual. And, of course, our Declaration of Independence proclaims that all men and women are created equal. And generations of Americans have strived and sacrificed to make sure those words apply to our people, all of our people. So we have much in common, and that's why I've always believed in something more than the strength of the U.S.-India alliance. I believe that a partnership between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy is a defining partnership for the 21st century. It can help chart the course for a better future, especially at a time when so much of democracy itself is being questioned. Now, the international order that we've sacrificed so much to create has become increasingly strained by the accelerating forces of change. Globalization, technological advance, terrorism, rising inequality, a rapidly transforming climate. And these shifts have all shaken the foundation of individual families, but also our collective politics and our common institutions. And that's been happening in developed and developing countries alike. The irony is, in some ways, the world, of course, is more prosperous than ever before, but alongside that prosperity, we've also seen a rise in inequality and wage stagnation across many economies that leave too many workers, too many individuals, too many communities fearful of diminishing prospects. The world, by most measures, and you wouldn't know this by watching television, is actually less violent than it has been in most of human history, but it still remains driven by old divisions and new conflicts and the slaughter of innocents. The world's more connected than ever before. But even as technology spreads knowledge and the possibilities of greater understanding between peoples, even as it gives a child in a small village somewhere in India access on just a single device to all the world's knowledge potentially. The internet also has the possibility to empower terrorists and tyrants, and the ability to transmit propaganda that is destructive to our democracies. And what's more, in an age of instant information where TV and Twitter can feed us a steady stream of bad news, with so much uncertainty, so much suspicion that maybe the center cannot hold, it leaves people searching for a sense of control. And unfortunately, that search can also lead people to adopt calls for isolationism, a new nationalism, racism, tribalism, sectarianism, a distinction between us and them that is dangerous, and that we saw from the 20th century and continues into the 21st century can wreak havoc on us all. So it's understandable that people are reacting, sometimes badly, to all the changes that are taking place, but it's important, I think, to remember that we've gone through moments like this before. Transitions from agricultural to the industrial era, times when you had new media that people were still absorbing and trying to figure out how to handle. And during these moments of great uncertainty, what's important is for us to push back against the temptations of, or the comforts of tribe, the politics of us versus them, and rather embrace the notion that we all have something in common and that we have to build off that commonality. Just look at how our two countries have succeeded. Having thrown off the yoke of colonialism, we crafted constitutions that begin with the same three words: we the people. We the people. As societies that celebrate knowledge and innovation, we transformed ourselves into high-tech hubs of the global economy. Together, we unlock new discoveries, from the particles of creation to outer space, and we're among the few nations that have gone both to the moon and to Mars. Here in India, this dynamism has resulted in stunning achievements. You've lifted countless millions out of poverty, built one of the world's largest middle classes. During the years that I was president, we set new records in bilateral trade, in the number of citizens that traveled to each other's countries, and the number of Indian students who studied in America. So our history together, our efforts together, at their best, speak to a common set of values. Values of pluralism and tolerance, the values of openness and the rule of law, a liberal market-based order that places the primacy on our individual rights, including the freedoms of speech and religion and assembly, and relevant to this session, freedom of the press, along with the commitment to the dignity and human rights of all people, not just some. We have to promote these values every day because there's a competing narrative. These values are often under attack, and if we are not constantly reinforcing them and passing them on to the next generation, they can wither away. We should feel confident about the progress that we've made during my lifetime and yours, but we shouldn't feel complacent. We're going to have to summon some of the same capacity to adapt to new circumstances and to meet these changing times while upholding timeless ideals. That's one of the reasons why Prime Minister Modi and I met an unprecedented 9 times, because all of the key challenges we face will be easier to achieve if India continues to play a larger role, not just in the Asia-Pacific region, but on the world stage. So at this defining moment, I've got a few suggestions for areas where we need to work. Fortunately, as an ex-politician, I don't have to provide a 10-point plan. Number one, I think we have to acknowledge the real economic forces that sometimes make our people feel powerless in the face of change. And we have to make sure that the high-tech economy that is emerging works for everybody and not just the few. Capitalism and open markets have raised global living standards, at an unprecedented speed, but the unprecedented pace of automation and globalization have also weakened the position of many workers and made it harder for them to obtain a decent wage. And automation is replacing work that used to provide a reasonable living for many families. Now, the thing is, we know that economies don't work as well when only a few prosper, and the middle class and people who are working hard to get into the middle class are neglected. And it also needs to be pointed out that economies that are unequal typically pose problems for politics. When the top 1% amass a bigger share of wealth and income that leaves everybody else feeling as if the game is fixed, and the view is that the government only serves the interests of the powerful, that's a recipe for cynicism and polarization, less trust in our institutions, and often the kinds of destructive populism from the left or the right or various other ideologies that take root that can kill the golden goose. So we can't unwind globalization and the global supply chain. We shouldn't want to. We can't pretend that automation doesn't exist, but we can invest in our people and their skills and their education and the capacity for them to start their own businesses. And we can modernize a social safety net that empowers those to take risks. So we're going to have to build new social compacts to give workers the power to organize for better wages. We have to have a tax code that works so that those of us who have had the great fortune of benefiting from this new economy also are paying some back in order to lift others and give them the same opportunities. And just as we have to work to continue to alleviate inequality in our own countries, we still need to do more work to close the gap between rich and poor nations. And making sure that fragile states don't collapse, making sure that countries where young people have no hope finally get some hope. That's not just the right thing, the charitable thing to do. It is in our self-interest. It is the smart thing to do for long-term stability. The second point I'd make is that most of the challenges we face, we're going to have to work together in multilateral fashions. As powerful as the United States or India is, it cannot solve many of these problems alone. I was very appreciative of the critical role that India played and Prime Minister Modi played in forging the Paris Accord to fight climate change. That was not an easy thing to do politically, but it was the right thing to do. And it's an agreement, even though we have a little bit of a pause in American leadership, that is giving our children a fighting chance. And the good news is that in the United States, you have states and companies and universities and cities that are continuing to work to make sure that America lives up to the obligations that we made in the Paris Accords. And I know that in a country like India that still has hundreds of millions of people without electricity, it is possible, and we're seeing the possibilities of growing that economy, providing people the energy that they need, but doing it in a clean way and leapfrogging the old dirty energies. Some of the ambitious solar initiatives that you've launched in concert with the Paris Agreement are already starting to bear fruit. So we have to work to lower our carbon emissions, but we can't do it by ourselves. Third, I would point out that diplomacy still matters, and that although we have not seen great power contests as we saw in the 20th century, with rogue states like North Korea and their missile launches, with disaffection in places like the Middle East, with terrorism still a constant threat, we can't just rely on our military and on weaponry to solve those problems. We also have to work together and encourage cooperation. We have to continue to lift up our ideals in order to shrink the circles of fear and despair and build the landscape of hope. And finally, and I'm particularly interested in the conversation that's been taking place at this summit because I'm somewhat obsessed with this issue. We have to recognize how technology is changing the way we consume information, and our young people in particular are consuming information. We're more connected than ever before, but it's also easier now to retreat into our own bubbles and only absorb information that confirms our existing biases and assumptions. You know, more and more we're fitting facts to suit our opinions rather than formulating our opinions based on facts. And this poses a great danger because democracies can't function if we can't agree on a basic baseline of what is true and what is false. And in countries like ours with an extraordinary diversity of peoples and cultures and religious faiths, if we don't find ways in which we can shape this new information age so that we're having a common conversation and we can listen to each other and understand each other and put ourselves in each other's shoes, then our grand experiment in democracy is going to be weakened. But I want you to know that I remain extraordinarily optimistic. When I spoke here 2 years ago, the United States and India were already moving in the right direction, but I pointed out, you know, we're not perfect. We all have work to do, and democracy is hard. Progress does not move in a straight line, and often the gains that we make in our countries are fragile. You know, we can take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But the trend lines, I believe, are in the direction of justice. The trend lines are in the direction of greater opportunity for people. I deeply believe in the liberal international order that together we have forged, that's not just based on military power or national affiliation, but is based on principles. The rule of law, human rights, individual freedoms. I believe that's the only choice for humanity over the long term. It's what's promoted economic opportunity, prevented another world war, and lifted millions out of poverty around the globe. So those of us who believe in those values and believe in democracy, we have to speak out forcefully. And that's what I intend to do now as a private citizen. But most importantly, we have to teach these values to our children. And that's one of the reasons why the focus of the Obama Foundation for both me and Michelle is going to be not simply speaking out on issues, but more importantly, training the next generation of leadership so that they can be that much more effective. So with that, I look forward to having a wonderful conversation, but let me just emphasize that if India and the United States are working together, I believe there is no problem we cannot solve. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
President Obama, a recent survey by Pew suggests that you don't just have a room full of fans, you have a nation of fans in India. The Pew survey says that my countrymen, 74% of them had enormous confidence in you when you were president, 77% thought of America as a positive country. And for what it may count, those percentages under your successor are just 40 and 56. So what does it feel like a country where most people think of you as a superstar?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to transmit this information to my daughters. Because those of you who are parents, I'm sure you've noticed that you are never a prophet in your own land. You know, I sit around the dinner table and they make fun of me and they think I'm silly. So I'm going to let them know of this information, that there are hundreds of millions, even billions of people who think I know what I'm talking about. Well, I do think that part of the strength of the U.S.-India relationship. And I benefited from that in terms of the work I did here, has to do with the extraordinary people-to-people ties that exist. There is a set of values, as I mentioned earlier, that we share, but there is an affinity that is that's based on family and friends. Last night I went to dinner, and there was some dal, and people were trying to explain to me dal, and I explained to them that
Power's coming back on.
testing. That's good. Okay. So I was in the middle of my dal story. That simple point I was making was I explained to the waiter that I didn't need to know what dal was because I had had an Indian roommate and a Pakistani roommate whose mothers had taught me how to cook dal. So I'm pretty sure I'm the first U.S. president to have a dal recipe, which is excellent. My keema is also excellent. My chicken's okay. But I use that as an example. Those kinds of connections, I think, extend beyond any policy that a government may make or the back and forth that exists in terms of the ebbs and flows of the national governments. And I think that exists between India and the United States at a level that is extraordinary and continues to grow. And I'm very happy about that because, as I said before, you have to have democracies of our size and prominence function effectively in concert in order to promote the values we care about internationally.
President Obama, we know you as a great president. Who would have thought you are a great cook as well? Can you manage a chapati?
No, chapati's too hard. You have to get it just right and flaky, and it's difficult.
Let me start with the last thing you did on the last day of your last trip, the town hall on the 27th of January 2015, and you said, and I'm going to quote you, "Every person has the right to practice their faith as they choose. Nowhere is that more important than in India. India will succeed so long as it's not splintered along lines of religious faith. Diversity is our strength, and we have to guard against any effort to divide us along sectarian lines." And as you said those words, not just me, But hundreds of journalists felt this is a message to the Indian government, to Mr. Modi perhaps in particular. Was it?
No, I think it was a message to all of us. I have said the same thing in private to Prime Minister Modi, but I've said the same thing in public in the United States of America. I've said the same thing in Europe. If you look at what is happening on the international stage, as I mentioned before, partly because people feel worried and insecure about all the changes that are taking place, some of which are economic, but some of which are cultural and social. There are demographic changes that are taking place, migration. People start looking different. There's a collision of cultures. People see much more vividly the differences between people. Sometimes they miss the commonalities between people just through the internet. And there is something in us, humans, that like making distinctions to make ourselves feel more important than the other person. And sometimes those are based on race, and sometimes those are based on religion. Sometimes they're based on class. They're always based on gender, and that's one of the things we need to focus on, is making sure that, because that's universal within all camps. And if you examine the course of human progress, where we have progressed is where we have reduced and if not eliminated, the barriers of these artificial distinctions. So that the reason you can have an outstanding business person who didn't simply inherit everything, but built it themselves, is because you have different rules now than in feudal times about who could aspire to enter into an enterprise. The reason that I'm sitting here is because somebody worked hard to reduce the barriers that said somebody who looked like me could not aspire to a certain office of leadership. And there's a counter-narrative taking place at all times, but I think it's particularly pronounced now. You're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in the United States, and sometimes you see it in India, where those old tribal impulses reassert themselves. And there are leaders who, I think, try to push back against those impulses, and then there are those who try to exploit them. And I want to make sure that we are encouraging as much as possible those voices that remind us that we work well together when we recognize our common humanity. And particularly in a country like India, where you have such an enormous Muslim population that is successful, integrated, and thinks of itself as Indian. And that is unfortunately not always the case in some other countries, where a religious minority nevertheless feels a part of. I think that is something that should be cherished and nurtured and cultivated. And I think that I think all far-sighted Indian leadership recognize that, but it's important to continually reinforce it.
President Obama, you began your answer very interestingly, and I want to pick up on it. You said this message that everyone has the right to practice the faith of their choice, and nowhere is it more important than India, is a message you've given not just publicly to the world, but privately to Mr. Modi. And I want to ask you, what was his response? How did he take the message? And I'll pause a moment and tell you why I asked, so you can answer both halves of the question together. You're aware that the Western press increasingly in the last 3 years, particularly since your speech in 2015, have been portraying India as a country where intolerance is growing. They talk about beef bans, they talk about cow vigilante lynchings, they talk about love jihads. So when you gave this message in private to the Prime Minister, there are many here who'd be keen to know, What was his response?
Well, you know, he's a very good journalist. I think it's fair to say that my goal here is not to disclose every private conversation that I have with other leaders, but I think his impulses are to recognize the importance of Indian unity. I know that he firmly believes in the need for that in order to advance to the great nation status that India possesses and will continue, I think, to amplify in years to come. But as I said before, I think it's very important to understand this is the work of all of us. Yeah, one of the things that I say in my farewell address in the United States is that the most important office in a democracy is not the office of president or prime minister or governor or mayor. It's the office of citizen. Because by definition, each of us have a responsibility in order to make our democracy work. And I think that obviously those of us, like myself when I was president, even post-presidency, Prime Minister Modi, others, our voices have more reach, and we have an obligation to deliver these messages. But it's the task of all of us to reinforce it. One thing I will say about politicians as a general rule, this is not directed at any, because I know there's some in the audience who are, I'm sure, outstanding public servants. So this is directed at me, it's directed at every elected official. Rarely do elected officials get out too far ahead of public opinion. And so if you see a politician doing things that are questionable, one of the things, if you're a citizen, is to ask yourself, am I encouraging or supporting or giving license to the values that I'm hearing out of the politician? Because, frankly, politicians tend to be more of a mirror and more a reflection of forces in the society. Every once in a while, they get out ahead and actually lead, but oftentimes they're reflecting. And so if communities across India are saying, we're not going to fall prey to division, then that will strengthen the hand of those politicians who feel the same way.
Now, President Obama, when you came for that visit, when you were the chief guest at Republic Day in 2015, you solved the problem of the nuclear liability issue that had been rankling for a while, and you called it a breakthrough understanding. To be honest, and you're aware of this, neither the American press nor the Indian press were quite as enthusiastic as you were. Almost 3 years have passed, and no meaningful step has been taken by either Westinghouse or GE to build a nuclear plant in India. So looking back, are you disappointed by the fact that the nuclear deal and solving the liability issue hasn't led to more productive results, particularly for American companies?
Well, you know, there's always a little bit of a mercantilist element to the job of leading a country. You know, you want to see your businesses doing well and engaged in other countries, and obviously the trade and cross-investment that takes place between the U.S. and India is extraordinarily important. My goal with respect to the nuclear issue was just to give Westinghouse and GE and other U.S. companies a chance, an opportunity. My job was not to guarantee that a deal goes through. That's a little bit below my pay grade at the time. I do think, in general, just to step back more broadly and look at the nuclear issue, I think the goal, from my perspective when I was president, was to assure that India, which had a significant nuclear infrastructure and remarkable scientists and needs for energy, et cetera, that we recognized reality. We put the nuclear issue on a stable footing so that it wasn't an impediment to strong bilateral relations, that we encouraged the kinds of safeguards and measures and international standards that all of us need to abide by. As you know, this was one of my priorities in the nuclear security summits that I hosted during my presidency, so that we wouldn't have nuclear materials falling into the hands of terrorists or non-state actors, that we were observing best practices in terms of how materials were handled and so forth. And on a wide range of those fronts, we made significant progress. The fact that particular contracts have not been signed and so forth is not something that let me put it this way, of the things that I lose sleep about during my presidency, that hasn't been one of them.
On the nuclear issue, there was enormous promise when you were president that India's application to join the nuclear suppliers group would come through. It hasn't. And China now is visibly and repeatedly blackballing India. How do you view this problem, and do you think China's attitude is justified, or do you think it's unwarranted?
Well, this is a sophisticated group, but I don't know if we want to get too deep in the weeds on the nuclear supply group. But the basic notion is whether India can be part of an organization of countries that have nuclear power and abide by a certain set of norms and safeguards, but are also then recognized internationally in order to be able to operate in this area. We worked very hard to try to get India into the nuclear supply group. It is true that the organization's charter is structured so that it requires unanimous consent of the members for a new member to join, and there were some who were concerned that India was short-circuiting some of the previous procedures that others had had to follow. Our argument was they are now meeting the standards that we abide by, so let's go ahead and just recognize that fact. We did not get the cooperation of every country. What we tried to then suggest was maybe there are some interim steps, an interim membership that might be available. I was not able to get that completed before I left because of resistance from some of the other countries. But I think, I'm sure Prime Minister Modi is still working on it.
But do you blame China, or do you understand China's response?
You know, I think that in international affairs, there are, it's sometimes hard to distinguish between motives of any given country. And so I wouldn't hazard to say definitively that China's objections were based on its views of competition to India versus their desires to follow certain procedures. And anyway, since it's possible that this is a project that your Prime Minister may still be working on and the U.S. government may still be working on, it probably is not wise for me to characterize the motives of one of the people who might be part of that decision-making.
Now, President Obama, you once said, and I'm quoting you, America can be India's best partner. On another occasion, you called Indo-US relations one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. And to be honest, both your predecessor and your successor have spoken in almost identical terms. But there are many Indians, and I'd venture to say perhaps a majority of Indians, who say that America makes a distinction between the terror groups in Pakistan like the Haqqani network that target American interests in Afghanistan, and the terror groups in Pakistan like the LET and Jaish that primarily target India. Not just to this audience, but to the country that's listening to you beyond. How do you address this concern? Because many Indians feel that when it comes to this question of terror, the terror we face is treated differently to the terror you face.
I can't speak for other administrations. I can say that that's not how we viewed it. When the crisis, the tragedy in Mumbai took place, we were as obsessed with how to dismantle that network as India was. And in fact, our intelligence and military personnel were immediately deployed to work with the Indian government in any ways that the Indian government determined would be helpful in getting this done. So I actually think that there is a historic recognition, and I say that because I don't want to claim that this was unique to my administration. I think the previous administration, the Bush administration, felt the same way, that terrorism of any sort directed at any country has a way of metastasizing, that you can't somehow say, oh, well, that's going to be their problem now, because eventually it becomes your problem later. I think what is true, and an understandable source of frustration, is the view that sometimes there are connections between explicit terrorist organizations based in Pakistan and elements that are connected to various more official entities inside of Pakistan. But that's not just true for terrorist organizations that were directed at India. That's true for those that, like Akani, that killed U.S. soldiers. And that that poses a difficulty. That's been a consistent, hard problem for us to solve. And that is, although Pakistan has been in many ways a partner in fighting against certain terrorist organizations, what is also true is that there are elements that sometimes have not been good partners with us.
Can I ask who these elements are?
Well, no. How's that? Yeah. So, but please go ahead. Next question.
I'm going to pick up on that thought of yours. In 2011, under your presidency, you had a phenomenal success in handling terror. American Navy SEALs flew undetected to Abbottabad and eliminated Osama bin Laden. Now, was Pakistan hiding Osama and therefore complicit, or was it unaware of his presence and therefore incompetent?
We had no evidence that the Pakistani government was aware of bin Laden's presence there. That is something, obviously, that we looked at. I will leave it to you to characterize beyond what I just said.
Then what I'll point out for the audience, without making it a question for you, is that if you had no evidence that the Pakistanis were aware of his presence, that suggests neglect or incompetence.
I think it is very important for you to stop trying to get me in trouble on stage with your words. So for those of you who are watching at home, I think Karen made a point based on his opinion. And it'll be useful not to tag that with, hopefully the Hindustan Times will not run a story of what Obama said there. Accuracy in journalism.
I put that very question that I put to you to President Musharraf when he came to the summit 3 or 4 years ago. And I asked him whether Pakistan was complicit or whether it was incompetent. And his answer was, and he happily, readily said this, Pakistan and the ISI were neglectful. And when I said, does neglect mean incompetence? He said, no, neglect means they fell asleep. And then he added, but the ISI has a right to fall asleep occasionally.
Well, that's an interesting answer.
A lot, President Obama, has been written and said about your relationship, your friendship with Narendra Modi. At his invitation, you came as chief guest. You were the first American president to come as chief guest on Republic Day. You did a joint radio broadcast together. And frequently, Prime Minister Modi used to refer to you as my friend Barack. What's your opinion of Narendra Modi?
I like him. And I think that he is... I think... I think that he has a vision for the country that he is implementing and is in many ways modernizing certain elements of the bureaucracy that I think are very important. But I really also was great friends with Dr. Singh. And, when you look at the work and the steps that Dr. Singh took to open up and modernize the economy and launch what I think was really the foundations for the modern Indian economy, that's also important. So I think, look, here's the bottom line. Because India is a democracy, it has politics, and that's a healthy thing. As a non-Indian and as U.S. president, my job was to work with whichever party was in power. And so to avoid you getting me into trouble again, what I want to be very clear about is that what I found with both leaders who were prime minister during my time, the unifying theme was that strong U.S.-India relations were important, that India's movement towards a more modern economy that would give opportunity and lift millions and tens and hundreds of millions of people out of poverty was important, that electrifying the countryside was important, that rebuilding infrastructure was important. And each leader obviously had a certain view of how that was going to be accomplished. My job was not to evaluate the details of their various platforms. My job was to see whether their general focus and trajectory was consistent with what I thought was sound governance. And I found both of them to be engaged, honest, direct with me, and both of them took tough decisions in order to help underwrite the international system. Keep in mind, Dr. Singh was the primary interlocutor with me when we were saving the country from a global financial meltdown. Prime Minister Modi was the primary partner in unlocking the Paris Accords. Neither of those things were easy, and both required some political courage back here in India. And so you will not get me to play those games when it comes to my good friends in India.
Now, these days, President Obama, politicians have taken to tweeting their thoughts on any subject, on any day, almost at any time. Do you think tweeting your message is a sensible way of dealing directly with the people, or is it dangerous because when you have to compress, you end up simplifying, sometimes distorting?
Yeah, well, this goes to the point I was making about technology. And it's fascinating. I have an excellent focus group in my daughters, right? Because they are the generation that is on their phones, and whenever there's some new thing or app, they have to explain it to me, and they're doing it very quickly, and I slow down, wait, how do I attach this to that? And and then they start swiping, and so I'm able to watch and keep up with how it's being used and how it's being absorbed. And what I would say is that Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, all these various platforms are extraordinarily powerful tools. And those tools can be used for good and they can be used for ill. I do think it is useful to understand, and we're just beginning to understand, what some of the inherent or built-in challenges exist within these new technologies. And you identified one of them, which is that it leads to a lot of snap judgments. And psychologists know that it turns out that most of what are called, quick snap judgments about complex issues are typically wrong. And so one of the dangers is that instead of deep analysis, or at least some skepticism towards initial information, and then the desire to learn more, evaluate, that we start seeing a generation or a citizenry generally that just looks at surface and the sizzle and not the steak, so to speak. I think I mentioned another tendency that we see is the degree to which these new technologies can create these information silos. In the United States right now, and this is not unique to Twitter, but it's part of a trend. Those who watch Fox News and those who read the New York Times occupy completely different realities. I mean, if I watched Fox News, I wouldn't vote for me because there's this unrecognizable character. I remember when I was president, every once in a while I'd watch, who is that guy? This character named Barack Obama, and he's just portrayed in these weird ways, and there are these selective clips that come out, where the sentence isn't finished, and then, it's all edited and shaped to promote a certain story. And obviously those who subscribe to that view would argue that the New York Times is doing the same thing in its own way. But the point, though, is that you get these multiple realities, and it's very hard then for democracy to work in those situations. I can sit down with someone and have an argument about climate change. And in fact, when we were working on the Paris Accords, and there were some folks within the Indian government who would say to me, look, we're a poor country. Our priority has to be getting power and electricity to poor people, and so we should not have to do X, Y, Z. And I said, well, I understand that. So we can have a debate and a dialogue around this. It's hard to have a conversation if somebody says, well, climate change is a hoax. So I can't, I don't know what to do with that. I can even have a conversation with somebody who says, yes, climate change is happening, but there's nothing we can do about it, and we should just adapt. We should just go up into the hills, or we should just build houses on stilts, or whatever arguments they might make about adaptation. But if you're saying it's a hoax, then there's no way for us to bridge our differences in a constructive way. So I say all that to suggest that those of us who are leaders in any field, and look, I've got 100 million Twitter followers. I mean, I actually have more than other people who use it more often. But I think it is important to be mindful about both the power of these tools, but also its limits, and to understand that it can be used for good or for ill.
On this very subject, speaking in Toronto on Tuesday, your wife Michelle said, and I'm quoting
what did she say?
She said, never tweet the first thing that comes to mind. Never tweet from bed. Always edit and spell check. Who do you think she had in mind?
Well, it wasn't me, because I do spell check, and I also use punctuation in my texts, which my daughters think is odd. They were explaining to us, oh no, if you put a period at the end of a sentence, it sounds harsh. I said, no, that's English. You're supposed to, that's how you know the thought is finished, it's completed. So I think she was just giving general advice, the same advice that you used to hear from your mother generally, right? Don't say the first thing that pops into your head. Just have a little bit of a edit function That's wise for life, generally. And you see in people getting into all kinds of trouble because they just send out some tweet and then they're trying to erase it afterwards. But somebody's screenshot it and then they're embarrassed. Hey, you know, your mother, your father knew better. Listen to them. Don't do things like that. Think before you speak. Think before you tweet. Same principle.
I won't say amen to that. I'll say kafefe instead. President Obama, my last question, because we're horribly out of time. America is famous for two Donalds, Donald Duck and Donald Trump. Which one represents the real America?
Well, let me say this. The thing I love about America, and I suspect the thing you love about India, is it is just this cacophony of life, and it throws up all kinds of variety. And there are political trends in America that I don't agree with and abide by, but I recognize as part of a running thread in American life. And one of the joys that I take about America, but also one of the frustrations is that it can be contradictory. And we can be very kind and noble. And there are times where we're cruel and short-sighted. And in that way, we're like people. And I think India is the same way. But what I take heart from is the fact that the trend lines of America, similar to the trend lines of the world, are for more kindness, more inclusion, more health, more education, more equality. I always say to young people, I used to speak to young people who would come to the White House or when I was traveling, and I would say to them, look, as bad as the news is every day, because that's what you're seeing, understand that if you had to choose a moment in human history in which to be born, and you didn't know ahead of time what your status was going to be. You didn't know whether you were going to be a man or a woman. You didn't know whether you were going to be rich or poor. You didn't know your caste or religion. So you're just the generic human, and you had to choose a time where you had the best chance to have a good life. It would be this moment right now, as bad as sometimes things are. Now, I say that not, again, to encourage complacency, but it is to remind ourselves that we make progress, but we make progress only because people of goodwill are willing to work together and struggle and learn from mistakes and pass on wisdom, and we have developed institutions like a free press that allow us to evaluate and critically examine the things that we're doing, and we've developed things like science that allows us to test our propositions and not just base what we're doing on superstitions, and all those things we shouldn't take for granted. And all those things we have to pass on to our young people and our children. And all those things are values that we have to speak out on behalf of every single day. And I hope that in my small way, going forward, I will continue to do so. All right? Thank you very much, everybody.
President Obama, thank you very much indeed. It's
Thank you.
been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, kindly remain in your places until the President of the United States has left the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly remain in your places. We will not be taking a break. We're moving on to the next session. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. We will not be allowing you to move out of the hall. Please remain where you are. Please stay where you are. We are not allowing you to move outside the hall. Please remain in your chairs. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly be seated. We will not allow you to leave the hall. The gates are closed. May I request you to please return to your seats. Due to security reasons, we will not be allowed to leave the hall. Please remain inside. Remain seated. We will be going on to our next session with Mr. Ambani, so please be seated. We still have a lot of you standing. May I request you to please be seated? We are not taking a break. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on to our address by the Chairman and Managing Director, Reliance Industries Limited, Mr. Mukesh Ambani. May I request you all to please be seated? Ladies and gentlemen, the Chairman and Managing Director, Reliance Industries Limited, Mr. Mukesh Ambani. Chairing the session, we have the Editor-in-Chief, Hindustan Times, R. Sukumar. Please be seated, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. Everyone here knows who Mukesh Ambani is. I will not introduce him the usual way he's introduced. To me and to many people in this room, he's a man who takes on really big challenges, really big projects, and does them really well. I don't know how he'll do when it comes to managing audio in a conference room, though, right? I'm sure he'll do a lot better. The way we are going to do this is he's got a small speech which he's going to make. And at the end of it, we are going to have a conversation. I'm hoping that we will have time to take at least one or two questions from the audience. You will find these cards on your table. So please, if you have a question, write them, hand them over to people. They'll come to me. And if I think they're interesting enough and if we have the time, I'll post them to Mukesh. The idea behind this session, which is what we've discussed, is to try and give you a glimpse inside the head of a person who's really thinking big, who's thinking of interesting things, who's thinking of innovative things, who's thinking of the next big leap. So Mukesh, thank you very much for doing this, and the lecturn's all yours.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm good afternoon. Thank you to Hindustan Times and Shobna ji for making me a part of this summit once again. The Hindustan Times Leadership Summit is about Hindustan's leadership in the world. 13 years ago, when I spoke here, India was a $500 billion economy. And I had said in 2004 that India would be a $5 trillion economy in 20 years. Today, that prediction seems certain. Indeed, it will be achieved well before 2024. Today, this summit is about India emerging as a preeminent global leader. Dear friends, I come from the world of business. Any nation's leadership role is determined first and foremost by its economic leadership. Therefore, I want to talk to you about why India will become a global economic leader. Today, India's GDP is about $2.5 trillion and ranks number 6 in the world. Can we triple it to 7 trillion in the next 10 years and then become the 3rd largest economy in the world? Yes, we can. Can we cross the 10 trillion mark by 2030 and close the gap between India and China and India and US? Yes, we can. Can India become the most prosperous nation in the world, overtaking both the US and China within this century? Yes, I think we most certainly can. We are seeing, and the entire world is seeing, a new and resurgent India. And I believe that the coming 3 decades will be the defining decades for India. In 2047, India will celebrate the centenary of our independence. Around the same time, China will celebrate 100 years of the birth of the People's Republic of China. Today, the whole world is talking about China's rise and India's rise. This is civilizational rebirth for both India and China. And to me, there is nothing surprising about it. In the long history of mankind, India and China were the most prosperous nations before the 17th century. And after a short interval of 300 years of Western domination, the center of gravity of the world economy is shifting back to China and India. But friends, today, again, I wish to make a prediction. By the middle of the 21st century, India's rise will be higher than China's rise, and more attractive to the world. Yes, India's rise will be higher than China's rise and more attractive to the world. India will provide a superior and different developmental model, a model that will create equitable and inclusive growth based on technology, democracy, good governance, and a society-wide culture of empathy. Let me elaborate why I believe this is possible. Friends, energy and technology have been the key drivers of human progress. No country has ever emerged as a global power without embracing new technologies wholeheartedly and without using new generation energy sources widely. The first industrial revolution used coal and steam power to mechanize physical activity. It began towards the end of the 18th century in England and lasted for over 100 years. This shifted the economic power from China and India to Europe. The second industrial revolution used electricity and oil to mechanize and mobilize industrial processes for mass production and distribution. It started towards the end of the 19th century and prevailed for roughly another 100 years. And this shifted the center of economic power to US from Europe. The third industrial revolution that began roughly in the mid-70s used electronics and information technology to increase productivity, automation, and greater customization. The US was the key beneficiary of this, followed by Japan. Among the developing nations, China benefited from this to emerge as the manufacturer of the world. Each technological revolution completely rewrites the rules of the game and creates a new world order. It creates opportunities for early adopters of that technology to leapfrog into positions of global leadership, power, and influence. Through the first two industrial revolutions, India remained on the fringes. India started catching up in the computer-driven third revolution. Friends, the fourth industrial revolution is now upon us. The foundation of this revolution is data connectivity, computing, and artificial intelligence. It is marked by a fusion of technologies straddling the physical, digital, and biological worlds. I believe human civilization will collectively achieve more in the next 30 years than what it has achieved in the last 300. I think it is crucial for all Indians to fully understand and internalize and change their mindsets on three defining characteristics of this new age. The first defining characteristic is that the world is going from linear to exponential. In a linear world, if you take 30 steps, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and you travel 30 meters in 30 steps. In an exponential world, where 1 becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, if you take 30 steps, you reach 1 billion. Exponential technologies and processes start slowly, but very quickly they bring about dramatic changes. Just think about it. Mobile telephony, the internet, e-commerce, social networks, virtual assistants, self-driven cars. These were science fiction just a few years ago. Today, they are facts of science. early adopters of each of these shifts will have the opportunity to leapfrog the competition and create unprecedented societal value. Those who do not will be outcompeted. They will become irrelevant. The second defining characteristic that we all have to understand is that the world goes from scarcity to abundance. For most of our history, humanity has progressed by extending our mastery over nature and by marshalling natural resources. But in the digital age, when you put the power of data connectivity, computing, software, information, and intelligence together, the price performance of everything changes drastically. Combined with the rapid strides we are making in renewable energy, life sciences, robotics, 3D printing, and machine intelligence, what we are looking at is the future possibility of abundance in the true sense of the word. Abundant energy, abundant health, abundant knowledge, abundant agriculture output, abundant manufacturing capacity, abundant renewable materials and energy. And unlike the past, this abundance will not be just for a privileged few, but for all. I believe that we are at the doorsteps of creating ubiquitous availability and affordability in each of these areas for every human being on the earth. The third defining characteristic is that we will see a migration from goods and services economy to one powered by intelligent services. Today, with the state-of-the-art digital techniques, it is already possible to monitor billions of data points from smartphones and other connected devices in real time, all the time. This information is continuously analyzed by machines, and a service can be provided automatically, not just in response, but even in anticipation of a customer's need. There is no doubt that in the coming years, machine intelligence will augment and multiply our biological intelligence many-fold. This means that truly predictive and targeted services, intelligent services, will be delivered 24/7, creating unparalleled user value, delight, and loyalty. I believe that intelligent services are the next frontier of competitive differentiation and market leadership across countries. We are in the age of super intelligence. What manufacturing was for China, super intelligence can be for India. We have the opportunity to not only rapidly grow on our own economy, but also to be the provider of intelligent services to the rest of the world. In this hyper-connected world, this will mean that a talented craftsman, even in the remotest Indian village, can participate and benefit from the global marketplace. Friends, technology is a great leveler. It provides equal access to all without prejudice or judgment, benefiting only those who are best prepared. It is my firm conviction that India can not only participate in the fourth industrial revolution, but has the opportunity to be a leader. And again, I have three reasons for this conviction. The first, India is a very young nation, 63% of our population under the age of 35. And our youth adopt to technology very easily. They have the talent, they have the ideas, they have entrepreneurial energy, they have the courage to dream big and the ability to realize their dreams. I have no doubt that they will make India the #1 startup nation in the world. Second, India's historical lack of infrastructure is actually a boon in disguise. Not having legacy technology base means we do not have to retrain. We can skip multiple generations of technology and directly embrace the next generation. Third, and most importantly, We have the political vision, leadership and determination and ability to make India a technology leader. Our Prime Minister's Digital India vision has created an alignment among all political parties in this mission of making India a technology leader. From my own experience in rolling out Geo in each and every one of our 29 states, all the leadership has embraced this vision fully. Friends, collectively these three factors have perfectly positioned India to be a leader in this new age. We can already see early signs of success around us. Take Aadhaar, which was started by my friend Nandan, as an example. With nearly 1.2 billion Indians enrolled, Aadhaar is the world's largest and the most sophisticated biometric ID system. India has created this infrastructure from scratch in the last few years. In this area now, India is a clear leader, and Aadhaar is now decades ahead of advanced economies like the US and China. Or take the example of ISRO. In February this year, ISRO created a world record by launching not 1, 2, 3, but 104 satellites within one single rocket. And this mission carried out not just Indian satellites, but also satellites from 6 other countries. More importantly, this we did in India at a fraction of a cost. India also became the 4th country to reach Mars, and we did that in its first attempt. Or take the example of mobile broadband penetration. Just a couple of years ago, India was ranked 150th in the world in mobile broadband. Today, it is number 1 in the world after the launch of Geo. Today, Indians consume more mobile broadband data than the US and China. So in a sense, we are ahead of the US and China. And if data is destiny, New India is well and truly ready for its new thirst with destiny. In the coming years, we will see many such success stories from India. Friends, we now have the opportunity to digitally reinvent all sectors of our economy, whether it is financial services, commerce, manufacturing, agriculture, education, and healthcare. India can leapfrog the world in each one of these sectors. Let me just focus on 3 important sectors: agriculture, education, and healthcare. First, I have chosen agriculture because we cannot ignore the reality of poverty and underdevelopment in rural India. Over 60% of Indians still live in villages. And by 2050, we will have close to 300 million more Indians to feed. Today, average farm yields in India are just 20 to 30% of the best global yields. There is both a pressing need and a golden opportunity to create a digital green revolution, an evergreen revolution. A digital green revolution means 1, digitally enabled mechanical services to benefit all farmers irrespective of their land holdings. 2, digitally enabled fertilizers and pesticides to rejuvenate the soil. 3, digitally enabled seed to crop processes to get the best yields and double and triple every farmer's income. 4, digitally enabled water management to achieve more crop per drop. And 5, digitally enabled supply chain from the Kisan to the consumer with full traceability to ensure quality at every stage and remove wastage at every stage. In short, data is not only the new oil, data is also the new soil. The second big digital opportunity is in education. India's population is our biggest asset, but we need good quality education for all to make them a productive asset. The goal is difficult to achieve with conventional infrastructure and traditional methods. We need digital tools and innovation to break geographical, social, language, and economic barriers. 200 million students study in 58,000 colleges, over 700 universities, and 19 lakh schools in India. All of these will be digitally connected, with Geo playing a leadership role. A student anywhere, even in a remote village, can have access to the best teachers and the latest knowledge in the world. Artificial intelligence-based technologies can bring personalized learning adapted to the needs of each student, and which can, in fact, overcome the gaps and constraints of classroom education, like any age, any time, any subject, and in any language. Now it is both possible and necessary to reorient education for the new kinds of productive and creative employment that will replace large numbers of existing mechanical jobs. This will help us in quickly imparting and upgrading the employable skills to millions of our youth. Within a single generation, we can empower and enrich our vast and young human resources to give India a competitive edge in the world. Healthcare is a basic human right for every Indian. However, India cannot emulate any foreign model to ensure this right. Constraints of budget, physical infrastructure, and trained personnel make it difficult to deliver quality healthcare to India's large and growing population. India can overcome these constraints by adopting digital tools and innovations. As in education, the best doctors and the best diagnostic facilities can become accessible to all citizens anywhere in the country. Shared medical devices and predictive healthcare will be able to save lives even in the remotest corners of our country. Fewer doctors and scarce facilities will serve many more patients across the nation. India can thus design a path-breaking and affordable healthcare system that will be a model for the rest of the world. When new technologies touch and transform the lives of all Indians, India's rise becomes inevitable. Reliance is a proud participant in India's rise and privileged to serve this new India. I have been fortunate to participate in building global-scale Reliance businesses in energy, information, and digital services. As energy and information converge in the future, Reliance will contribute even more significantly to India's rise. 5 years ago, when most Indian businesses were investing outside India, we decided to invest over $60 billion in India. We have completed this investment cycle, and we are now ready to commit even more in our next investment cycle. We are doing this out of our undiminished conviction that India is the biggest investment opportunity in the world. Therefore, to foreign investors, I have a simple message. Be a part of India's rise, invest in India, earn in India, grow in India, partner with India, and prosper together with India. Dear friends, as I mentioned earlier, in 30 years, India will celebrate the centenary of our independence. In these 30 years, we can and must aspire to grow from a $2.5 trillion economy to become the most prosperous nation in the world in the 21st century. I will safely predict that from now on, every new generation of Indian will live a better life than the previous generation. As the internet becomes accessible to all Indians, I believe we will be among the first to graduate to the internet of everything, the internet of communications, content, and commerce. But I believe that we have only scratched the surface. In the coming years, I can imagine an internet of intelligence that powers next generation smart services, an internet of energy with smart sensors, smart grids, and distributed generation that lays the foundation for our nation's energy security, an internet of trust that creates the framework for distributed transactions and contracts without intermediaries, an internet of empathy that harmonizes value creation and life-sustaining human and ethical values. I believe that India is well positioned to combine its demographic, technological, entrepreneurial, and civilization strengths to seize this opportunity and create a bright and prosperous future for our nation. As a nation, we must rise to this occasion. The climb is difficult, the challenges are many, and the goal cannot be achieved by any one person or one enterprise. All of us, 1.3 billion Indians, will have to work together with a single purpose to realize this. We must have a partnership among all sections of society to realize this in the fastest possible time. Collectively, let us commit ourselves to work together to make India's rise a reality and make it irreversible, make it unstoppable, and may God bless us as we embark on this most exciting new era in India's history. In many ways, we are all pilgrims of progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukesh. As you can assume, we have a lot of questions, and Rini's just messed up by putting some questions on top of ones which I had selected. All right. There's, of course, one very interesting question here which gives a mobile number and says if you're free to say hello after the meeting, please, I want to say hi to you, which we will ignore. Or we'll keep aside, maybe you know this person. There is this fun question which says, you are such a great economic influencer, why haven't you ever thought of being the finance minister of India? Which I think you should answer so that we can get at least that audience question out of the way. No?
I'm in business, not in politics.
Okay. All right. I thought we'd do this a little differently. I've got questions for Mukesh. These are not audience questions, these are my questions. And I've arranged them in order of difficulty, A, B, and C. A, least difficult, C, most difficult. If you want to call them otherwise, you can call A, Simi, B, CNBC, and C, Sebastian. Some of you will know why these names have been chosen. So I'm going to pick these questions out at random and answer them so that we can have some fun. Okay, this is a CNBC question, right? Which means it's B, moderately tough, very focused on business. You spoke about the huge amount of investment that you've made in Jio. And there have been questions asked in several quarters about your ability to recoup this investment and how much time it would take. But you are, everyone knows how shrewd you are a businessman. So it's highly unlikely that you would be doing things for charity. So how soon do you expect Jio to turn profitable?
Well, Jio's results are declared every quarter now. And you can see the trend. And you watch the next few quarters. You will learn in January and you will learn in March. I don't want to predict, but I think we're ahead of our schedule in terms of the returns that we are generating.
Which should we watch closely, Jan or March? I told you this was a CNBC question.
Watch all the 3 quarters.
Okay, this is all right, this is actually a 4th category of question. We are going to a slightly more difficult one because, like I said, one idea is to provide people here some insight into what you're thinking and how you make decisions. How do you decide how to enter a business? You spoke about all these interesting new areas that are emerging. What are the parameters a business has to meet before Reliance decides it wants to enter it?
Well, I think the Reliance DNA started from my father when he founded Reliance. And at that time, is ingrained into us that as a business, you must solve problems. And the economic value is more a byproduct of that. So if you look at the history of Reliance, we started with clothing people. We started with textiles. We went into developing the textile industry. We then built our refinery, which was really energy security. We solved the problem at that time in terms of India not importing diesel and petrol. And if we look at our own entry into retail, it was linked to the need for employment creation. And as our balance sheet becomes stronger, right, we still look to solve problems, to create societal values. And now I challenge myself and our people to solve the more difficult problems. And we can take some risks. So what we did with Geo is really we put in and not many in the world had backed us, but as I just explained, we are strong believers that if India and 1.3 billion Indians have to participate in this new world, right, for us, we cannot always have the data infrastructure 20 years after the world. We would have no chance. Today, we have, along with Rajan and Kumar, along with all of us as one industry, I think that India in terms of data infrastructure will be ahead of the US by 2019. And so as we move forward, we think about more and more difficult issues that create value for all Indians. And, I talked about, I think that agriculture is difficult, and that's something that needs to be taken. Education is important, and healthcare is the most difficult. So we would clearly think about what we can do in each one of these areas.
Okay, follow up to that question, which is also a CNBC question, which is, you spoke about creating value for all Indians. I think it was earlier this week, last week, one of your rivals in the telecom business had an interview in a newspaper where he spoke about Jio actually destroying 50 billion of their value in the telecom business. And there is this perception that is there of Reliance entering into businesses and fundamentally disrupting them and destroying the competition. Do you think that would be an accurate assessment of what's happened in telecom?
Correct your questions many times. Sunil is a good friend of mine, is not a rival. Right?
A business rival.
I don't think of businesses in terms of... the second piece is, I think that, again, what he said and what I think you are interpreting is different. But just to make my point of view clear, I think that for all of us within industry, right, profits and losses are risks that we take. And I don't think that we can rely on regulators or governments to guarantee our profits or losses. To me, what is most important is, do we really move the country forward? And does the consumer gain? And I think that the question as a journalist that you should be thinking about is that even if there are profits and losses, who gains and who loses? And as long as the consumer gains and the country moves forward, it's worth taking those losses, right? Some of us are big boys, we can afford that.
Yes, that is true. All right. Okay, this question, because you're often referred to in terms of, a lot of people define you in terms of your wealth. I've seen a lot of descriptions that define you. What does money mean to you now?
Well, frankly, money has never meant much to me. I abhor the labels and the titles which all of you refer to.
I haven't used it even once.
In terms of where we are. But to me, resources, right, enable you to take risks from a company point of view to which you would have not done. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility. On a personal level, very few people know this, but my sister Nina is somewhere in the audience. I have, from childhood, right, I have, in school and together now, I have never carried money. So I don't have a credit card, I don't carry cash in my pocket. I always have somebody around me who pays for me. So that works.
Okay, so we know who wasn't in the queue last November, right? Okay, there are at least 3 questions here which have come from the audience, which I've spoken about what you, in the course of your speech, you also mentioned agriculture, and all of them are saying it's clearly an area where there's so much to be done. Why doesn't someone like you, why doesn't someone like Reliance get into that area in a really significant way and make a difference?
See, I think that, and what I said is, and things that I genuinely believe is that this is a time where things are coming together. There are combinatorial technologies without really covering the landmass with data technologies, without the sensors at the right price, right? Without an overall vision, like, you know, things have to come together. And I think that things are coming together. And India is a great opportunity. And surely, as Reliance, this is a difficult problem to tackle. But we are ready to take on difficult problems. And we are, it's very much on our roadmap. We're building all the resources. We think through we just don't jump into anything. We think through it carefully. But agriculture, education, and healthcare, all 3 are on our roadmaps, which are, to my mind, the most difficult problems.
They're very fundamental problems.
And they impact all,
but
like
you
a
are
majority of our people.
You are thinking in terms
Absolutely.
of that. Because both in education and healthcare, you have these little foundational experiments that you've done. But and I don't think all 3 are probably areas that can benefit from the kind of scale that you usually bring to businesses.
Absolutely. And also what we will be able to do in the next 5 years in terms of just raw usage of technology. And if we can solve, this is the most difficult problem to solve. If we can solve it in India, we can pretty much use that anywhere else in the world. And that is why I say India has the opportunity to lead the world, right? We have the opportunity first to solve it in India and then take it to the rest of the world.
Okay. 4 more questions, 1 from category C and 3 from category A, which means 1 Sebastian and 3 Simis. Okay, first for the tough question. From its inception, Reliance has always had this reputation and image of being an extremely competitive company. And you look at most of the businesses that you've gotten into, especially Geo, for instance. You were not an early entrant, you were a relative late entrant. There were incumbents in place, and not just ordinary incumbents, but there were huge incumbents. And you really seem to be relishing the challenge of this competition and everything else. So is this something you thrive on? Is it something that motivates you? Or do you just look at it from the consumer point of view?
Well, our DNA is that we are very focused, right? And we always believe in the principle of saying that if you focus on the goal, you will overcome all obstacles. If you focus on the obstacle, you will never reach your goal. And we are all believers of first principles. And from our point of view, while, like, you know, the external world can see it, we are pretty much, we work very hard and we focus on the goals that we want to achieve. And we focus on first principles. And clearly, we at Reliance want to be the best in the world. Like it was even in the 70s and 80s when my father said that why should the Koreans and the Taiwanese lead the polyester industry, right? Why can't we in India be? And today we are known, we are the biggest in the, like, both, not only in size, but in quality. We have exactly the same conversation with Sunil and Rajan and ourselves in terms of saying that in the data-driven digital services business, why can't India be the best? And that's what drives us. So I'm sorry if it appears very competitive from outside, but we just want to be the best in terms of what we do.
Okay, three questions, like I said, from category A. Your children are now in the business, and you worked very closely with your father when you first got into the business. What was the one thing which has really helped you that you learned from your father? And what is the one thing which is really helping you now that you've learned from your children?
Well, one thing that I would never dare tell my father is that, Dad, you don't get it. And I pretty much I think that with this generation, that's the big difference.
Do you get a lot of that?
I get quite a bit of that in terms of I saw this speech, and the first thing Isha told me is, Dad, very boring. All this stuff. So, and I think that as far as my father is concerned, he's been really the biggest influence. He treated me like a friend, and I hope that I can treat my children as a friend.
What are you reading now? Do you get time to read?
I make it a point to read quite a bit. So I have I read a lot of technical stuff. So I'm reading gene editing, CRISPR, blockchain on the technical side. I read non-fiction. So I read 5 or 6 things at one time. So then in non-fiction, I'm reading, there's a great book that's come on Leonardo da Vinci.
Walter Isaacson.
By Isaacson. He's my favorite author, so I read everything that he is. And then I'm just finished Dan Brown's Origins. So I like him as, so I read fiction,
you read
non-fiction,
fiction also.
and technical all at the same time.
Excellent. Okay, last question. How would you define success?
Well, for me, it's really fulfillment, which is important, which is the lasting satisfaction that you have, that you've really tried your best, and you've given it everything that you have, right? And sometimes, in spite of that, you might not achieve your outcome, and you have to reconcile with that. And that's what my philosophy in life is.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, Mukesh Ambani.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. May I request Mr. Rajiv Verma, CEO, Hindustan Times, to please present Mr. Ambani with a memento. Thank you very much, Mr. Sukumar and Mr. Ambani. Ladies and gentlemen, we continue to the next session where we have Anuradha Sengupta, consulting editor, CNN News 18, chairing a session on resilience. Resilience in the face of adversity. Please be seated.